The realm of media is like a vast abyss, and with the sheer amount of content, it can easily feel like you're drowning. And no form of entertainment is this more prevalent than it is in comic books, a century-spanning medium absolutely loaded with reboots, retellings, and changes within its own history. Even if you're a fan, it gets to be a total mess to follow very quickly. Here, today, I'm going to present to you the starting point of DC Comics, how it came to be, what to read, and how many of their early stories, while important back in the day, deserve to be left alone, aside from some truly special tales that have been forgotten to time. Now, DC Comics as we know it today actually only took on the name in 1977. Way back in 1938, they were known as All American Publications. They were about on par with any other comic company at the time, like Archie Comics or Fawcett Comics. Within the company, however, were two men who helped get the ball rolling for the exciting tales we have today, Harry Donenfeld and Jack Leibowitz. Donenfeld was a pulp writer in the 1920s, writing things like spicy mystery and spicy western. He used the word spicy a lot, but to summarize, he put a lot of work into spreading the story of Superman into other mediums after the Man of Steel was brought into the world of comics. Leibowitz wasn't exactly cut from the same cloth. He was an accountant at heart. He handled the finances and business specifics. It's thanks to them that Superman even had a place to call home, since the business would have fallen flat pretty quickly when it came to money. Speaking of, let's pay some lip service to the Man of Tomorrow's creators. He was made in 1938 by the historic Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, two young men born into two similar families of Jewish immigrants. They invented the idea of a man who could do anything, save anyone, no matter how challenging a feat it may be to accomplish. He was the embodiment of hope, plain and simple. Superman, the world's very first superhero. Of course, he wasn't seen as a big name right away. In fact, Siegel and Shuster had a very difficult time trying to find a publisher who would even take them in. They shopped the idea around to countless publishers before finding a place within the modern DC Comics, thanks to Donenfeld and Leibowitz. Superman, once he reached the newspaper stands, sold incredibly well, making over 200,000 sales within its first printing, and the publisher, obviously very happy with the outcome, wanted to see if lightning could strike twice. Bob Kane was commissioned to come up with a new hero that could be on the same level of sales as Superman, and in turn, he approached Bill Finger for help with a simple concept, the Batman. Of course, it's fairly well recognized at this point that Bill Finger was the true idea man behind the whole thing, and Kane just happily put his signature on a lot of the work, but it's still necessary to acknowledge that the very initial idea was his, even if he only got as far as making a man with bat wings, whereas Bill Finger created the costume, Batmobile, Bat Signal, the Joker, and pretty much everything else we associate with the Dark Knight these days. There were, of course, other people working on comics at the time, the creators of Wonder Woman, Shazam, Dr. Fate, and many others, but let's be honest, I'd be rambling on about them all day, and that's not the full point of this video, as much as they all do deserve some time in the spotlight for the work they put into the now incredibly expansive realm of comic books. Let's move on. So, the golden age of comics began with the introduction of Superman, and suddenly shelves were flooded with the ideas of many comic creators who wanted to set their own mark on the new genre of storytelling. The DC Universe quickly began to expand as well, introducing more characters like Wonder Woman, The Flash, and Green Lantern. Though, you may have noticed that The Flash and Green Lantern may look quite a bit different from their modern counterparts. That's simply due to these being the original versions, Jay Garrick and Alan Scott. Once the Golden Age wrapped up, new versions of the characters were created to hopefully sell better than their predecessors. But we'll talk about that another time. Of course, the medium changed over the years, adapting to the real-world events going on at the time, most obvious being the Second World War. Suddenly, Superman was fighting overseas and inviting readers to buy war bonds. Innumerable villains were Nazi invaders, and narratives began to shift onto the importance of truth, justice, and the American way. Other factors also affected the storylines that writers wanted to tell. Oftentimes, editors would encourage odd creative choices to boost sales, such as the truly confounding idea that paperback issues would sell well if they included a gorilla on the cover, which is why modern comics have characters like Kongorilla, Gorilla Grodd, and the Ultra Humanite. It still confuses me to this day, but hey, the numbers don't lie. It actually worked. Somehow. Another big change came later on in 1954 with the creation of the Comics Code Authority, a system put in place to avoid narratives that could be seen as problematic for depictions of violence, sexuality, and basically anything else that those on high horses in the 50s felt they should turn their noses at, basically neutering a lot of the harder-edged narratives that could have been told at the time. This led to a sweeping change in the comic book industry worldwide, reducing the creative storytelling options to ones that were deemed non-threatening, and eventually closed out the golden age shortly thereafter due to a focus on child-friendly storytelling. DC Comics published hundreds of paperback comic issues from 1938 into the mid-1950s, many of which can be looked back on for their historical significance. Superman and Batman, as well as Wonder Woman, are literary icons nowadays, and it's important to recognize where they came from. Although they would eventually be replaced with newer versions into the Silver Age, it's also important to acknowledge the Flash and Green Lantern from this era as well. The stories were read and beloved by thousands upon thousands of children nationwide, and can still be looked back on fondly. It was a grand time for fans of superheroes, and truly deserves the title of the Golden Age. But now we get to the main crux of the Golden Age, and ultimately the reason why this video, which was meant to introduce people to the classic age of comics, is so short. A great many of these stories just do not hold up at all. Either the story they tell is fairly run-of-the-mill, or thanks to the time period it was created, it's problematic for its depictions of gender and race. So, to make it easy, I've crafted this whole section to summarize the very best that can be offered by the Golden Age of DC Comics. Of course, we have to start with the big one, the tale that created a multiverse. Superman is introduced in a relatively simple set of tales that show off exactly what he can do. It's iconic, and it's easy to get swept up in the importance of this genre-making comic. Nothing beats the story that introduces Superman. Jay Garrick, for one reason or another, has always been my favorite version of the Flash. This story, the one to introduce him, has a lot of focus on how having super speed can be utilized to make fun in the world around you, or protect the ones you love. The story is ultimately pretty quaint, but has a lot of heart that I find endlessly charming. Although, in my mind, it's more of a Clark Kent story than a Superman one, The Orphanage Adventure is a comic that I enjoyed quite a lot. It goes a long way to deepen the relationship between Clark and his perpetual romantic interest, Lois Lane. The story itself is, again, fairly low stakes, but offers a fun little narrative with a few one-off characters. Another classic in the halls of DC Comics, The Legend of the Batman of course introduces the Batman, as well as his arch-nemesis for over 8 decades, the Joker. The issue offers a handful of his early adventures and gives a fun way to reflect on the Dark Knight's early days in American graphic literature. Although the original introduction of Robin itself falls a bit flat, the Batman plays a lone hand I feel goes to show how much Bruce Wayne values his relationship to his ward. It's a classic sort of Batman story that can be easily enjoyed by those just now getting into the older comics. Although not perfect, the story of the boy genius honestly gets me right in the heart. The Flash has obviously had nearly 100 stories by this point, but this issue in particular really proves how he cares about people and the youth in America at the time. Children have so much creative potential and ability, and this one really pushes the notion that anyone can be truly great in their passions if they believe in themselves. Not to mention, the tale has some classic super speed hijinks. Pretty much the only really solid story outside of the more famous DC comic lineup from the time, The Haunters from Beyond includes a more vague and ominous side of the universe, pressing on the ideas of classic horror while maintaining 1950s camp in a semi-supernatural thriller. This, I feel, is an old Superman comic that's just been forgotten to time. Although it riffs on some story beats that have been done to death by the decades since its release, Superman's Big Brother provides a really interesting bit of old Superman lore, explaining just how Jor-El, Superman's father, was able to create such an advanced rocket to send his son off in when nobody else on Krypton could do the same. If there's one thing that comes to mind when I think about Superman, I think about how campy he was back in the day. The portrayal of Superman really proves that in a fun, if kind of silly way. The story is relatively straightforward, with Jimmy Olsen, Superman's oldest friend, being pushed to reveal the Man of Steel's secret identity. It doesn't hold up to the fridge logic the readers may get after they put the comic down, but it's fun to read in the moment. So, that's it. Roughly 20 years of steady comic releases, and that's it. 9 whole issues worth your time. In the future, I do plan on touching on many more stories for each era of comics. In fact, I'm only partway into the Silver Age and have over 60 to talk about, so, well, keep your eyes peeled for when that drops. Despite the fact that it's earned its place in comic book history, I want to be honest and say that a lot of the older narratives are just not worth paying attention to in the modern climate. Many of the stories are stereotypical, if not downright racist, and frankly deserve to be remembered, but certainly not revisited. But hey, if I missed a comic from the Golden Age that you think deserves a second chance, let me know in the comments. I'll be exploring the other eras of comics over time, so I'll definitely take a look. Until then, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.